600 passengers sit trapped in a stalled train outside Brandenburg, Germany on June 28, 2026. A storm knocks out the power. The air conditioning dies first. Then the doors lock, the way emergency doors are built to, and stay locked until firefighters force them open by hand. 2 people are hospitalized before anyone gets out. That same week, Météo France confirms the country's hottest day since records began in 1947, 30 degrees Celsius, averaged nationwide, beating both 2003 and 2019. Within 4 days, more than 1,300 people in France are dead who wouldn't have died in an ordinary June, most of them over 65. American trains don't fail like this in heat. Neither do American houses. That's not luck. It's a design decision nobody remembers making, and Europe has been warned about it before. Something happened after that first warning, and it explains why nothing has changed at all. The World Health Organization does not usually put a number on a weather event within days of it happening, but on June 29, 2026, Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus posted a figure that had been confirmed, not estimated: more than 1,300 excess deaths across Europe since June 21st. He added a line that sounded less like a diplomat and more like a warning label. European homes, workplaces, and schools were not built for these temperatures. Spain's Carlos III Health Institute logged more than 1,028 heat-related deaths in June alone, its second hottest June on record, according to the country's daily mortality monitoring system. The United Kingdom recorded its hottest June day on record, hitting 37.3 degrees Celsius in Santon Downham, Suffolk. Germany broke temperature records for 3 consecutive days, reaching 41.7 degrees Celsius in the town of Caution near the Polish border. These are not undocumented villages or crumbling infrastructure in some poor, overlooked region. This is Germany. This is France. This is the United Kingdom, one of the richest countries on Earth, setting a heat record it has never seen. Meanwhile, United States Energy Information Administration data puts air conditioning in roughly 88% of American homes, in a country that gets plenty of brutal summer heat of its own, sometimes worse than Europe's. Same heat. Radically different survival odds. It would be easy to file all of this under unprecedented weather and move on. Extreme, unlucky, a freak year nobody could have planned for. But Europe has lived through a heat wave death toll before, one measured not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. And what happened after that heat wave, or more precisely, what didn't happen, is where this story actually starts. Look at what actually broke across Europe this June, and it stops looking like weather damage and starts looking like a design failure. In Germany and Sweden, rail tracks physically warped in the heat. A 600-meter freight train derailed near Bollebygd, Sweden, when the rails buckled beneath it, and Deutsche Bahn issued a nationwide warning urging passengers to avoid unnecessary travel. In France, roughly 68,000 homes lost power at the height of the heat wave, straining a grid that was engineered for a cooler climate decades ago. In Leipzig, no trams ran for nearly a full day because the heat had damaged the tracks and switches. On the train outside Brandenburg, the air conditioning wasn't a comfort feature that happened to fail. It was a life support system with no backup. In a country where extreme heat is now routine, not rare, in early summer. Compare that to a typical American post-war tract house. Ductwork for central air isn't an upgrade bolted on years later. It's poured into the blueprint before the foundation is even framed, standard from the day the house is sold. The obvious explanation for Europe's failures is that nobody could have predicted heat this extreme, this early in the year. That explanation has one serious problem. Someone already did. In August 2003, a heat wave killed more than 70,000 people across the continent. A documented, published, peer-reviewed number, not a rumor or an estimate from a tabloid. That was 23 years before this train got stuck outside Brandenburg. 23 years is enough time to reinforce a rail line, harden a power grid, or write a building code that assumes hotter summers. The infrastructure didn't fail in 2026 because engineers made a fresh mistake. It failed because nobody was ever legally required to fix what had already failed, in public, in 2003. On June 25th, 2026, Under a nationwide red heat alert, 21-year-old footballer Kenzo Keys drowned in the Rhone River. Keys played for Annevant Guingamp in France's Ligue 2, young, professionally conditioned, exactly the kind of person the phrase vulnerable population is not supposed to describe. His club released a statement saying it was saddened to learn of his death and extended its condolences and full support to his family. He wasn't elderly, he wasn't isolated, he wasn't living alone on the 6th floor of an unventilated apartment block. The image most people picture the instant they hear the words heat death. He was young, athletic, and trying to cool his body down in a country where the air itself had become something to survive rather than simply breathe. His death did not happen in isolation, and it did not happen for lack of information. Red alerts covered roughly 3/4 of France that week. That same week, the country recorded roughly 40 heat-linked drowning deaths nationwide, people jumping into rivers, canals, and reservoirs because their homes, their schools, and their public spaces gave them no other functioning way to survive the temperature outside. Keys is not the outlier this story needs to make sense of the numbers. He's the data point that confirms what the statistics were already saying before he ever entered the water. This heat isn't just killing the already fragile anymore. It's testing the limits of healthy, conditioned adult bodies inside structures and public spaces that were never engineered to keep anyone safe from their own summer. Somewhere between a stalled train in Brandenburg and a river in Guingamp, the question stops being about weather and starts being about what these countries were willing to build, and what, deliberately or not, they chose to leave out. No building code failed Keys directly, but the absence of one, repeated across an entire continent, is exactly why a healthy 21-year-old athlete had to go looking for relief in a river in the first place. Here's the part that finally explains the gap between the two continents. In the United States, no federal law ever required a single home to have air conditioning. The Federal Housing Administration's minimum property standards, the rulebook that decided which homes qualified for federally backed mortgages after World War II, never mandated it. And to this day, HUD's handbook still doesn't require central air. What the FHA system did was something quieter, and in the long run, far more powerful. It created a market where a home's appraised value climbed when it had modern climate control installed. Willis Carrier had already made residential-scale compressor units commercially viable by the 1930s. Post-war electricity was cheap, subsidized, and rapidly expanding across new suburban grids. Put those two forces next to an appraisal system that rewarded modern construction, and builders had every financial incentive to install central air as a default feature in new subdivisions. Not because a regulator forced them to, but because a house without it simply appraised for less money at resale. By the 1960s and 1970s, air conditioning wasn't treated as an amenity in most new American construction. It was assumed the way a working kitchen sink is assumed. Europe never built that same incentive structure into its housing finance system. Building codes across France, Germany, and the United Kingdom historically regulated heating efficiency, keeping warmth inside during long, damp winters because winter cold, not summer heat, was the seasonal threat that reliably killed people. Landlord-tenant law across most of the European Union today still legally obligates a working heater in a rented home. It does not obligate a working cooling system. And for decades, European energy and climate policy actively discouraged residential air conditioning expansion, citing concerns about electricity demand spikes and rising carbon emissions, worries that are now colliding in real time with exactly the extreme heat scenario those policies never planned around. Cooling didn't quietly fall through the cracks in Europe. It was left out on purpose by policies and codes that assumed the summers Europe used to have, not the ones it has now. The rule that could have kept the Brandenburg train's doors from locking, that could have kept Kenzo Keys out of the Rhone, was never written, not out of malice, but because nobody with actual regulatory power was ever forced to write it. The scientific proof that this would keep happening has existed for nearly 2 decades, in plain, published language. In 2008, French demographer Jean-Marie Robin and his colleagues published a study in the journal Comptes Rendus Biologiques, confirming that more than 70,000 people died across 16 European countries during the summer of 2003, a number built from daily regional mortality data, country by country, essentially impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or panic. France alone accounted for 14,802 of those deaths, according to the country's National Institute of Health. And what was the official political response at the time? The administration of President Jacques Chirac and Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin largely pointed at families who had left elderly relatives unattended during the August vacation period, at France's 35-hour work week, limiting how many hours doctors could put in, and at family physicians who were themselves on holiday. Not the buildings, not the codes, not the total absence of any legal requirement for cooling in French rental housing. In 2023, researcher Joan Ballister and colleagues published a follow-up study in Nature Medicine, estimating 61,672 heat-related deaths across Europe in the summer of 2022 alone. Proof, in a fully separate dataset nearly 2 decades later, that whatever lesson 2003 was supposed to teach had never reached the built environment itself. Germany's own Robert Koch Institute has been forced to publish weekly reports on heat-related mortality throughout the 2026 heat wave, tracking a toll its public health system did not have to formally measure before this decade. In France, emergency rooms logged 300 to 450 daily visits for heat stroke, severe dehydration, and dangerously low blood sodium in the week leading into the June 24th record, under a monitoring indicator the health ministry calls iCanicule. And now, in 2026, the World Health Organization is delivering the same warning publicly, in real time, for a third time. 3 separate death tolls, published 19 and then 23 years apart. 3 separate moments where an authoritative, named source stated the underlying cause plainly and on the record. And still, in most of Europe, zero legal requirement that a home be built or a landlord be obligated to keep it survivably cool during a heat wave. That is not an accident quietly repeating itself by chance. That is a warning being issued 3 separate times to the same audience with the same missing structural response every single time. To be fair, France did not do nothing after 2003. In 2004, the government built Plan Canicule, a national heatwave response system with early public warnings, mandatory wellness checks on isolated elderly residents, and designated public cooling centers in cities across the country. It worked. No comparable nationwide legal framework exists in Germany, the UK, or most of the countries now recording their own record-breaking June temperatures, which helps explain why rail networks and power grids in those countries were left just as exposed in 2026 as French rail and grid infrastructure was. In the 2019 heatwave, when temperatures hit 46 degrees Celsius in Galargues-le-Montueux, hotter than almost anything recorded during 2003, France's excess death toll came in at roughly 2,500, a fraction of 2003's toll under comparable extreme heat. That is a real reform, built on a real lesson, and it genuinely saved real lives. In 2026, Plan Canicule activated at the largest scale in its entire history. 58 departments placed under a top-level red alert simultaneously, the widest coverage the system has ever needed to deploy, with emergency services fielding more than 122,000 ambulance calls at the height of the heat. And here's the twist: the warning system cannot paper over. The train still derailed. The grid still buckled, cutting power to roughly 68,000 homes at the exact moment air conditioning mattered most to keep vulnerable people cool and safe. The doors on that Brandenburg train still locked shut around 600 passengers because the train itself, like the rail line beneath it, was never engineered for a summer like this one. Plan Canicule can tell people when to stay indoors, drink water, and check on elderly neighbors. It cannot retroactively install a cooling system in a French rental apartment, reinforce a warped rail line in Germany, or expand an electrical grid that was designed decades ago for a cooler century. France solved notification. It never solved infrastructure. And in the summer that has finally outheated the warning system's original design assumptions, that single distinction is the whole story. Go back to that train outside Brandenburg. 600 people sealed in by doors that locked exactly the way they were engineered to, waiting for firefighters to force their way in, while the air conditioning that was supposed to keep them alive sat completely dead. That image isn't a freak accident, and it isn't bad luck. It's the physical residue of 2 very different decisions made decades apart on 2 different continents by people who never met each other and were never accountable to each other for the outcome. In America, a quiet post-war appraisal rule made air conditioning a competitive necessity, and builders installed it everywhere because the housing market demanded it, not because Congress or HUD ever required it outright. In Europe, no equivalent structural incentive was ever built into housing finance or rental law, and 3 separate, well-documented death tolls, 2003, 2022, and now 2026, have still not been enough to force a legal one into existence. Kenzo Keys did not die from an unpredictable natural disaster nobody saw coming. He died in a country that had already been told, in a peer-reviewed scientific study published almost 2 decades earlier, exactly what would keep happening if nothing structural changed. The American house was engineered by an economic incentive nobody alive today remembers voting for. The European house is still waiting on a law that thousands of documented deaths, spread across 3 separate summers, haven't yet been enough to finally right. Until it is, the doors will keep locking, the tracks will keep warping, and the next Kenzo Keys will keep looking for a river.